This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back to The Quiet Professional. Today, we are going to be talking about the Middle East and the United States, the ongoing conflicts in the region, and how to frame some of these issues. For that, I have Stefano Ritondale here. Stefano brings deep, first-hand operational experience as the lead intelligence planner and opposing forces analyst for the intelligence section of the 32nd Army and Air Missile Defense Command. He advised U.S. forces across multiple Middle East deployments on Iranian ballistic missile, cruise missile, and attack UAV threats. He has also worked closely with the Israeli Defense Forces and allied partners, providing his expertise on the Al-Ghadr Missile Command, which is Iran's ballistic missile unit. Now, Stefano is the co-founder and chief intelligence officer at Artorias. I want to make sure I'm saying that right. I get that right? Artorias?
Yes, you did. Artorias, yeah.
They are a global risk intelligence provider that delivers actionable intelligence to governments, Fortune 500 companies, airlines, and multinational firms to inform risk management, protect personnel, and safeguard assets worldwide. So welcome, Stefano.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you guys and talk about a very important topic, Iran, and hopefully other topics as well.
Yeah, we're going to get into a whole ton of stuff today. I'm going to, right up front, full disclosure, I'm not the most versed on the Middle East. I find it just one of the most confusing places between all the different groups and sects of religions and things going on. It's like, Jesus, I can't keep it straight. But I'm glad that we have you here. We'll start just by talking a little bit about yourself for the people who might not know you or seen you. Obviously, check out the podcast you got there, All Source News. You see it in the background there when we put out the clip. I want to talk about yourself and maybe a little how you got into talking about missiles for a living. Because, I think most people played with them as a kid, but now you get to do it for a living.
Yeah. So, again, thank you so much for having me. My name is Stefano Ritondale, and background, graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy. It's one of the service military academies in the United States, similar to West Point, Annapolis, the Naval Academy, etc. I graduated from there, but commissioned Army, did active duty, armor, MI, then kind of transitioned to the reserves. And while I was in the reserves, obviously it's part-time, so I had another job, which was I was a contractor for KBR, but specifically we were working with the 32nd Army Air Missile Defense Command, and the 32nd AAMDC by their acronyms is kind of the lead unit for U.S. Army Patriot and THAAD, right? The air defense assets. And as you're talking, as the intro said, my main role was an Op4 analyst, the opposing 4 analyst. So my role and responsibility was, in essence, what are the threats air defenders face? And I have to replicate that in basically their military exercise. So what is the threat for them? Number one is ballistic missiles, right? And that's kind of an interesting aspect for most other militaries. The air defense, like the primary threat for an air defense unit would be like, fighter jets. Yeah. But for the U.S. military, that's really why we have such a large air force.
Yeah.
So the threat for them is ballistic missiles, and they had a lot of deployments into the Middle East, and so my job was to replicate it. And so that was my focus. Like, how does the Iranian ballistic missile force fight?
Okay.
What is their doctrine? How would they do it? And I did that for almost 6 years. In that time, I created my account on X, and I just kind of expanded to social media, but I'm really mostly heavily on X. All Source News. That I focus on Mexican cartels. That's been kind of a focus of mine. So Iranian ballistic missiles on one side, and then, Mexican cartels. That background, I deployed to the border in the first Trump administration. And so between my border deployment and then training the Mexican militaries, and I realized that the Mexican cartel problem set from an OSINT social media perspective wasn't being analyzed properly or extensively. So I was like, I'll kind of jump in as a hobby. And that then just became a huge focus. And that is actually one of the main reasons why I'm now a co-founder of Artorias, because a lot of the guys that founded Artorias or my company were OSINT guys. We do a lot of OSINT on social media. And yeah, we do AI, data-driven intelligence and analysis and collection, leveraging AI. So, that's a quick down and dirty of what I did. But yeah, Iranian ballistic missiles and Mexican cartels, kind of weird things to focus on.
So you're talking about doing the OSINT stuff through AI. Is a lot of your background, is it formal training through the military, like the education piece on AI, or did you take this in like universities at some capacity?
No, yeah, that's a great question. What's interesting is, because that actually hits to the point. I don't necessarily do the AI portion of the company, right? What I do, right, because we actually have one of the other co-founder, our chief technology officer, Shane Curtis. He was also an MI military intelligence analyst, but he also had a lot of background in the technological side and like in the engineering aspect. And so he does a lot of that, and also our CEO. My department, though, is we're the human element of the company, and our job is because we have our own proprietary measures of collecting information. We have our own scrapers, and so we tell the AI where to collect information, and then we make sure the analysis is sound and good and perfect for anybody who uses it. Because even for example in Iran, I mean, that there's a significant risk for a lot, not only corporations and governments, and just people, and that's why we have it. And we have an app called SitRep that I think if people were to see it, right, it's a subscription base, but it's an international news, basically every country. And so our team of professionals, we know where to collect information. We have the understanding and the tradecraft, and that's my department. Because in the end of the day, we want to make sure that the analysis you're getting is sound, and AI is only good information in, information out. So if you give it garbage, it's going to give you garbage. And so that's why you need the human element. And you need, a lot of us are military intelligence background and intelligence background to make sure that it's doing a good job, because it's not just a tech issue.
Well, would a lot of those sources be available publicly? So, and if they are, is it something that, you put out there so other people can kind of go look at it?
So a lot of the sources, I mean, you have your general, everywhere around the world, you have your sources from all over, your news agencies and all that. But we also expand a lot more than that. For example, we have sources that are heavily reliant, for example, on social media. For example, in Mexico, there's an area of my focus and expertise in cartels. If you want to track cartel violence, depending on the state, there are phenomenal tools and Facebook groups of people that kind of talk about eyewitness testimony, say, hey, I just heard this, I just saw this, I just saw this, I just saw this, right? And so those are areas. There's others that, although, yes, they are obviously not, there's nothing that we do that is inherently classified. But if you don't know where to look, or if you're not been in focus on that, it's very, very hard to get it. Obviously, kind of in this recording, kind of have to keep it broad, but a lot of us have experience and understand for a lot of the intelligence collection requirements. These are very hard to access areas of information that we know how to get there and ensure that we can collect that information and disseminate it out.
That just makes me think of, like, historically we've maybe had, a handful of traditional media. You'd go to your CBS or up here CBC, and they might have journalists embedded with stuff. Now it is insane. And you don't know who's an actual journalist. People are just on the ground taking pictures, uploading it. All of a sudden they become popular and they become a voice. But are they, I don't know, are they real? Are they not a bot maybe? But also, how credible is it? So I guess that's what you guys kind of do. You just funnel it in and can kind of hone it in a little bit more for people to understand.
Correct. And it's interesting, right? And this is, it's so funny. I literally had a conversation right before we recorded this, some kind of an interview. But I tell people, be careful, because again, you're doing this from an intelligence perspective, right? And there's a slight difference when you're saying it from a news perspective and an intelligence perspective.
Okay.
There's a lot of similarities, but there could be finer tunes, and a lot of it is the analysis, right? Because our AI does analysis, and not just an alerting. It's not just this happens. Like, no, like here's a historical context, and then, oh, by the way, here's like why it matters, right? In how we push it. For example, today Russia announced that France, as instigating coups in Sahel against Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. France was part of an assassination plot against the leader now of Touré in Burkina Faso, who's kind of the military dictator who took over after a coup. Obviously there's kind of this Russian bravado where, there's enemies everywhere to the West are hell-bent on destroying everybody, right? And I think a lot of the issue is you run into is people kind of like dismiss it. It's like, oh, that's just Russian misinformation, right? And you hear that and it's like, well, wait a minute. You have to analyze that. And not in the sense of, is it true or not? Like if you look at our AI, how it analyzes it, it's like, no, this is clearly a Russian information operation geared to undermining France's reduced status in the West Africa and to continue to reduce that and solidify Russia as a premier geopolitical partner in the Sahel, replacing France. Like that's why the Russians do this.
I can tell you nobody I know that has seen that news would even remotely think of it that way though. But it's good. Like, I mean, you're bringing up a really good point that you need the depth, but I just find so much of the stuff nowadays very superficial, clickbaity, just headlines, right? Like it's, and go to All Source News to get some in-depth stuff. So,
it's funny, but it's so to your point, like I can spend hours working on something on a post it, gets nothing. I upload maybe a video of a cartel member doing something, just for, they're here.
It explodes.
And just because the video gets, people, oh my God, it's cartels. And, but that's the thing. It's also like, how much of that is me trying to get information, what people want. And I think the issue it could also be the explanation of, I think it's trying to, when you're analyzing very complex problem sets, sometimes the simpler the explanation, the easier it is for people to digest it.
Yeah.
And then when you try to go to very complex problem sets, that's when you might lose them.
There is it's partially on the person that's taking this in to go out and seek that further information, all right? I want to understand this more. People only have so much time in a day. I get that. But before they go blasting on social media, like they're the expert on something, it's like, maybe you want to read a little bit more. Or what I really appreciate from a lot of the analyst types, I'll say the intelligence side of this world, when I'm reading some of their stuff and they can really just draw a line down the middle and say, there's this thing happening here and this thing happening here, but here's all this context to it. And a good way that it was put to me, and I've been kind of copying it since, was it's from a prior guest I had on here, and they talk about the difference between complicated and complex, where a complicated problem, you can look at it and go, okay, if I would have changed this one thing or two things in the equation, we could have diverted and went somewhere else. Complex, you can only really look at in hindsight. And then it's not as easy as saying, well, if I change this one thing, we would have got the result we wanted, right? We would have saved lives or, diverted a crisis. But when you're doing that, it's just like, if you change the one thing, it would have actually changed these two other things out here. And then that has a ripple effect further out. But people don't seem to understand that maybe. It's hard, or they don't have the time.
It's a trade craft. And even, the article I was interviewing was kind of this idea of like, we've even seen it like in corporations of Fortune 500 where they kind of de-risk them. Like they kind of remove the geopolitical intelligence perspective of their corporations. Like, well, that's, probably now that's kind of rearing itself back in. And then the issue we kind of see when we're having these conversations, one of the problems, as I notice, is there's a lot of conversations about, it's like they want the alert. Like, when did it happen? It happened now. And it's like, okay, that's important, but there's a lot more to that. And if all you're doing is trying to receive alert, then you're being reactive.
Yes.
And the reason why you do intelligence processes and intelligence analysis, and it's a continuous process, is because it enables you to be proactive.
Yes.
It enables you then to plan accordingly. So when something happens, you have the plans in place to execute at the moment that a trigger event happens that requires it, rather than, here was the trigger event, now I know about it, but because it wasn't proactive, not only do we have to build and execute the plan while the crisis is happening. And I think that's where I think we're starting to see something that has been so fundamentally neglected within the last 20 years. I think at least in many areas is coming back. Now we're talking about large, Fortune 500s. That's something we're starting to slowly see. But to your problem set now is when we're talking about the media and social media. Now it's, well, what's the truth and what's the lie? And that has to go more about source validation. I think, again, it's an intelligence tradecraft. A lot of us understand sources and how you validate them and how you analyze them. And, like an Iran perspective, that is a fundamental important aspect. And even when it's state media, let's say an Iranian state media, they still have very key information that they drop there in the public domain that is very important to analyze. Because if not, you can miss critical events and then things come as a surprise.
Yeah. You know what? Just on that proactive, reactive, the spiel you just did there, I'm going to play that on loop for Canadian law enforcement. We are so reactive up here. And I know I'm bringing it a little bit smaller than what some of the topics are going to be today. But my God, like this is something that I've been trying to bash into people's heads, and talking about that proactive versus reactive piece. Like, go out and try to develop sources and learn about things ahead of time. Can we get ahead of stuff? Whereas usually we're kind of on our heels and just reacting to whatever the news put out. So I really like it.
I literally had an interview podcast last year with a U.S. law enforcement, retired police officer who does that. He does training for small and medium towns, right, in the United States for police officers, because they have very small, in most of the cases, no intelligence department.
Yeah.
And so he's trying to get to a point where, well, how can you, with the small town, small officer, small budget, what trade crafts can you learn to that point to be more proactive and not just always reactive? Or more importantly, what might seem like a normal stop, just because maybe with some critical information, if you had access and knowledge about it, can fundamentally transform from just a normal traffic stop being involved in a multi-million-dollar drug bust. That it's just some small details that you just have to keep an eye on. And funny enough, a lot of times major bust happens because one idiot made a mistake and an officer said, wait, I know you, or I know what this means. And then you execute. But I would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Maybe that kind of transitions really well into what we're going to talk about today. The world is crazy right now. As of today, what's today? February 3rd? February 3rd, it's like 1,300 hours here. So I'm going to get this out in the next day or two. But at least people know the context of where we're coming from. Can you kind of frame for us just what's going on in the world and in the Middle East right now between the US and Iran, and I guess what it all means for all of us?
Yeah. So what I would say is when you're looking at Iran, and you really have to go at the start of the year of 2026. Right, to kind of analyze what happened, right? At least from this perspective. Obviously, we can go further back, but like, what was the kind of the trigger event that really started this cascading effect? And it was economic protest in Iran. For our listeners and viewers, look at just to simplify it, the Iranian economy is non-existent. I mean, it has completely collapsed.
I saw their dollar the other day was like point and then like 10 zeros and one of a US dollar.
I think they literally released a $5 million bill, the real.
Wow.
Which is about $3.
Wow.
Right? So their currency is worthless. It's collapsed. Inflation is a problem. The capital, Tehran, is legitimately running out of water. Like literally one of the main problem sets that the Islamic Republic and Tehran was dealing with at the end of 2025 was the president literally saying, we might have to evacuate the capital because we're running out of water.
Wow.
I mean, so you had all these, and oh, by the way, we're not even talking about the 12-day war with Israel in the summer of 2025, where kind of this image and an impression of Iran and the Islamic Republic, for all intents and purposes, was shattered by Israel's military campaign, right? So you had all these convergent issues and problem sets that kind of took hold at the beginning of this year with these. First, it started out as economic protests and kind of really widespread. The bazaars, the merchant class in Tehran, interestingly enough, joined the protest, which is always kind of they're historically been more tied to the clerical rule. They're kind of part of that middle class in Iran that is very interested in maintaining the status quo, right?
Yeah.
They started to join in the protest, but the protests really started to take kind of like this anti-regime element, right? It's not being necessarily just economics, and it took a much more anti-regime perspective. And it really came to head on January 8th and 9th, the weekend, And I remember, it's actually funny, Evan, who we knew, right, who kind of got us in contact. I remember sending Evan a text message that kind of started all this. It was like, hey, we need to keep an eye on Iran. And the reason why is me and, our analysts who were looking, we got two pieces of information that to us said, okay, let's ring the bell. Let's, Red Star Cluster, there's a problem here. And what happened was Iran announced two things back to back. One, they deployed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to help quell the protests, and I'll go into that, who they are in a second. And two, they announced an internet blackout, right? They shut down the internet in the country. And what's interesting is that happened in the same day.
Okay.
Like two major developments at once. And then we even started to get reports that the Iranian army, the Aritesh, which is their military, also was quelling the protest. Like those three events, one of it is already a problem. Three of them is a crisis.
So I'm guessing like in the past, they've done those things, but just at different periods.
Either, they're spread out. They're more spread out, right?
Yeah.
And then they kind of escalate in that aspect, but from a larger time period, days or weeks. This was like the same day.
Okay. So I'm guessing you're going to get to it, but is this panic on their behalf?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And so for your listeners, just quickly, if I may, if you're analyzing Iran, right, the military. So just like we are used to the U.S. military and the Canadian military, right? It's just the Ministry of Defense, the Pentagon, the Armed Forces. That's the Iranian Aritesh. That's the Aritesh. They have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, right? That's who they have. But they also have another element that is separate from the military, but is also kind of a military force, and it's called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which the United States and now the European Union has declared as a foreign terrorist organization. I believe Canada as well.
Okay.
I know Australia has also referenced the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. The IRGC's main role and responsibility is to protect the Islamic Republic, kind of the theological underpinning of Iran, right? Now, the IRGC has their own military component. They have the ground forces, they have a naval force, they have an aeros force, which is their air force. Under the air force is the Al Ghadir Missile Command, which is the ballistic missile guys, right? So that's underneath the IRGC Air Force. And then you have other elements, but one of the other key ones is the Besiege. The Besiege is kind of the militia. And generally when protest happens in Iran, it's the police and then the Besiege are kind of the two that handle the protests, right? That's generally what we see in the riot control. But to your point, on January 8th, when they said, hey, we're shutting down the internet, and oh, by the way, we're deploying the IRGC and even the military, what that indicated inside of Iran, there was paranoia, extreme panic. And I was actually doing some X spaces and stuff like that. We were talking about the protests. And kind of one of the conversations was coming, it's like, well, if you kind of looked at the videos that was coming out of Iran, it at least all the way back then in January 8th, and even January 7th, January 6th, like the protests didn't get to the level of 2022, where it was the Mashi protest was kind of the women's veils and the women. Those were massive protests that eventually were also, used violence to squash. But the videos that were coming out, I was like, okay, it's not giving 2022 vibes, and let alone even less 2009, the Green Revolution, which was a massive revolution inside of Iran. So it was like, well, why are they doing this? And the argument I made was, well, it doesn't matter why. They're concerned, very concerned, extremely concerned. And if you're deploying the IRGC and if you're deploying the military, more than likely what that means is they're going to go scorched earth on the protesters. They're just not going to care.
And maybe like you're saying, not so much about the why, but why? Why are they doing that? Well, why this time as opposed to those other times? Especially if there's been prior ones, protests and that have been bigger.
Yeah. I mean, I think Iran is in a very tough spot geopolitically, number one, right? I mean, there's many ways you can analyze this. One, geopolitically, they've isolated, right? Their proxy network has been devastated, right? Hamas gone for all intents and purposes. Hezbollah has been absolutely gutted. And it's kind of like almost to the point where Israel, for your listeners, Israel conducts almost airstrikes inside of Lebanon almost every single day.
Yeah.
They kill Hezbollah operatives on a daily basis, and Hezbollah does not respond, even though there's a ceasefire in place. Israelis are operating with absolute impunity in Lebanon, and Hezbollah has nothing, can't stop it.
Okay.
Right. And Hezbollah was the premier proxy force of Iran.
Yeah.
And so you see that the economy is in a much more worse position than we've seen in the past. One of their main geopolitical allies, Russia, is wholeheartedly consumed inside of Ukraine. And like the interesting aspect is what people don't remember, the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened in February 2022. In January 2022, there was massive protest in Kazakhstan, and internal elite tensions. And I'll simplify, right? That it got so bad that the Russians deployed their VDV, which is their paratroopers, over to Kazakhstan to help stabilize the situation. This is right before the invasion, right? Well, now they can't. The Russians can't do that.
Yeah,
they're so consumed. They don't even have the capabilities to do that. And oh, by the way, Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, is gone, out, kaput.
And he was friendly with them.
Yeah, 10 years that Iran leveraged to build its infrastructure and influence and its Shia crescent, as King Abdullah once said, and all that in Syria, in a matter of 10 days, that like literally 10 days, all that disappeared in December of 2024.
Well, even on top of that, I guess some of the stuff I've listened to these geopoliticists types, when they talk about Iran and their forces, all the armed forces that they have, they say they're not so much for projecting power. So a lot of their stuff is about keeping the population in check. So if they got nobody to help them outside, no proxies that are kind of in a position where they can help, Russia is busy doing their own thing, then they're really they're kind of stuck to their borders. Not that they can't, launch things out, or they're, the proxy still can help a little bit, but it's not what it used to be.
Right. I mean, I think for a lot of the militaries around the world, they're always kind of gears for homeland defense or their own internal territorial integrity, right? And I mean, the Iranian military is the same. I would just be a little bit. I mean, the IRGC, specifically the Quds Force, is the expeditionary arm of the Islamic Republic. But you would have to analyze them if you want a historical example. Think of the Soviet advisors during the Cold War going to advise, kind of these communist countries in Africa, right? Or even China would do that. North Korea and Zimbabwe. I mean, that's kind of what the IRGC does, right? Specifically the Quds Force, but not only. I mean, it's the entirety of the IRGC, and in many cases, even their proxies, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, do that. The Iranians have a significant presence with the Houthis in Yemen, and the pro-Iranian militia groups in Iraq, like Kataib Hezbollah, and so they kind of leverage that for the expeditionary. But to your earlier point, so you have that the economy, the military, the geopolitical, everything. I honestly believe we saw the supreme leader say this recently in a speech over the weekend on Sunday, and I think we can't discount it. And it's the idea that I think the supreme leader genuinely believed that the protesters were like a U.S.-Israeli plot to overthrow the Islamic Republic.
Isn't that what they always believe? At least they say it's everybody else.
Yeah, but again, I don't know why. I think there's a problem when we try to analyze geopolitical situations with countries. We try to be realist because in a way, it's almost like a Western way of viewing the world.
Yes.
And you try to analyze it from state actors, the president, but then you have you have the president, but then you have the country and the legislative branch and all, and it's almost like this kind of rational actors, checks and balances and all that. And for some reason, people literally just can't talk about they genuinely believe their own conspiracy theories. A lot of these authoritarian governments, because there's an idea that, okay, we create a conspiracy theory, let's say Russia, and then this information warfare perspective, right? And they kind of push that. And obviously, a lot of that is, they might know it's kind of bullshit. But I think we truly underestimate how much they believe their own bullshit.
Yeah. I'm
sorry for saying that.
You can swear on here. You're good.
But here's a perfect example. Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, the crazy situation is that Russia legitimately did have the military capabilities to take Ukraine. Outside, then we just realized that the Russian military was completely hollow and worthless and is full of corruption and ineptitude. Mm-hmm. But the other problem is they literally thought that they just needed to kill Zelensky and they would and then send some guys over, seize the airport, and they would walk right in and seize it, kind of like Crimea 2.0 in 2014.
Yeah.
They truly believed that the Ukrainian military wasn't going to fight, that the vast majority of Ukrainians wanted to be part of Russia. They genuinely believed Like, it wasn't just IW. No, that was their legitimate intelligence assessments. And what the comparison I would say is, well, we've seen this in the West, which is the WMD in 2003, right? Why can't we use that same process in understanding these authoritarian governments? And the supreme leader, specifically after the 12-Day War, I think genuinely believes, like in this paranoia, that this was a plot patched up by the Israelis and the Americans to overthrow the Islamic Republic. And if it's not domestic discontent, but it's a foreign invasion or manipulation of your country to overthrow your form of government, an insurrection, and in many ways, the protest from when they took anti-regime started to morph in this kind of almost like, not necessarily insurgency as in Mines RPG shooting, but it started to become much more challenging of the state authorities and actually start attacking state symbols. Well, the supreme leader said, well, this is an affront against my country. I'm going to authorize the military to just gun everybody down. And that's where we see the estimates of anywhere between 6,000 up to 30,000+ dead. And I think it's because they genuinely believe that this was a foreign plot. And that's the only explanation that makes sense how the blackout and the deployment of the IRGC and even the military happened so quickly. Because it shows that regardless of the why, and there's all these aspects of it, I believe more is the paranoia, they felt this was a fundamental risk to the Islamic Republic, much more so. And the irony, even though the protests originally didn't look like they were that big, they viewed this as a bigger threat to them than 2009, 2019, and 2022, which were the kind of the historical large revolutions, and some of them in the mid-90s, early 90s.
Well, you know what? This kind of makes me think of, and there's a lot I want to get to in what we're talking about here. So I'm going to try to go back to some of this. But
I'm sorry. Just keep on going. But
no, it was really good. I want to go back to the Western mind thing for sure. The guy at the top, he's only as good as the people feeding him information and what he's seeing on the news or whatever sources they use, right? So maybe in this world we're in right now, whatever information is getting fed to the guy at the top, he truly believes, like you're saying, this is it. Like, we got to unleash everything because we're at the end. Whereas those other ones, even if it was a bigger protest, maybe they had something that made them think, you know what, I can kind of control this. It's not as big of a threat in these areas. So to bring it to real small scale, when I think of like handling informants, and I handle some of these informants that are in organized crime and people who put hits out and get hits put on them, the level of paranoia, like I like that you were bringing that up because they go out and do just some of the most irrational things. And when you're trying to figure this out as law enforcement, you go, well, why is that guy killing that guy? But now he's friends with this guy. And then yesterday they were all swapped around. And, it's like we try to use a rational mind, or what we think is rational, to explain the irrational. People who are on drugs, who are constantly paranoid because everybody's backstabbing each other. Like, who knows what goes on in their minds, right?
Yeah, and I think it goes back, and I think the reason why people in the West don't say this, and the paranoia, because I think many people is like, oh, that's just a cop out. Like, is that really an analysis? Oh, he's paranoid. And I can see how people, exactly. It's like, well, but it's like, but you have to explain it. Okay, he's paranoid. So this is what it means.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, this causes problems. This is going to cause problems, as we saw with what happened. I mean, they killed, some of the estimates are up to 30,000 civilians were gunned down in Iran in 2 days.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
That is an insane statement. That is an insane statistic, right? Like, I don't want to, if we're going to talk about Israel and Gaza, 2 days, even the lower casualty estimates that are in the thousands would still have surpassed in the same time period anything that we've seen there, which is defined Israel and Gaza as a high intensity, high casualty conflict, specifically in the civilian population. And so I think that's what people are afraid to say, this paranoia thing. And to your point about kind of this Western analysis, I really do believe, and it's not from a cultural perspective, because there's a lot of analysis that I think, even when we're trying to analyze it from a different perspective, even from cultural sensitivities, we might get it wrong. I think the fundamental issue that we generally run into from a geopolitical, again, we're talking macro for a second, right? And like Iran, or if we're talking China, Russia, we generally analyze it where I said the Western construct is the rational actor idea, which basically boils down to that every leader is operating under this construct of a rational actor that's going to further the interests of the state. Now, in dictatorships, those authoritarian leaders are the state.
Yeah.
But the thought process for them is, well, if I enhance this, and it inevitably enhances my own benefits, right? And I think the problem, and there's many cases that absolutely that happens, 100% those issues happens. But it also goes back to, and these authoritarian leaders, and I loved how you said it, kind of the closing of information, the lack of right information getting fed, because we know, for example, Vladimir Putin is not getting updated, correct information about the situation in Ukraine. That then causes them not to act rationally.
Yeah.
And, you know, and one of the important aspects, and when you're doing intelligence, is psychological profiles, right? Every intelligence agency that serves any kind of country, when you're meeting a foreign dignitary, they have not only a biography of that individual, but that key component of that is the psychological perspective.
Okay.
And I think that is not being leveraged enough when we're trying to analyze decision makings that happens at the leadership level in these other countries. And we frame it from a Western mindset of, oh, we're all rational actors. We're all acting in a sense of as the state, or for even, you know, politics or democracy or blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't translate accordingly to Iran. And that's why we see the Islamic Republic and the supreme leader. Yeah, you might like it or not. His actions show he was concerned that this was going to cause the overthrow of the regime, even though if it wasn't backed by any evidence whatsoever.
Yeah. You know, and I think you kind of hit on some of the points that I was going to try and bring up with when we talk about the Western mind and just how we understand things, just as a public, just as citizens in Canada or US or, you know, Western Europe. When we look at things, we try to frame it within our own understanding, but the rest of the world has a very different understanding of stuff. Right. And they think of things differently than we do. And I think we can find that hard, even in the law enforcement, the intelligence world. People within that still have trouble framing these issues. Just so we stay a little bit on track, we'll kind of come back to talking about Iran and the scope of things. So we kind of laid out where things sit right now. I know today, and I was just seeing this on the news, that the U.S. had shot down one of the Iranian drones that was approaching one of the U.S. carriers. There was a destroyer and an Air Force were sent to assist a U.S. tanker that was kind of getting buzzed by a bunch of little boats. So things are starting to heat up. Do you think we're at a point, are we getting close to like a breaking point? Is something happening in the next, few weeks here?
I mean, it's very interesting, right? How you said that, because yes, one of the drones today that was shot down was a Shahed 129, which is kind of like the equivalent of the U.S. Predator drone. And then the speedboats are the IRGC Navy, and I believe the Shahed 129 probably came from the IRGC Aerospace Forces, not necessarily the regular Air Force. Okay. But at the same time, we see a lot of negotiations going on right now. I mean, I think the shooting down of the drone kind of maybe throw a little wrench where the Iranians are now threatening to walk off from the negotiations or threatening to derail it. But, we have to be very careful, specifically when we're doing this analysis in the Trump administration, right, to see that just because it looks like negotiations are happening does not mean that the order has already been given for strikes to occur. They're just waiting for the right moment. We saw that in Venezuela, right, January 3rd. Nobody expected the operation that led to the capture of Nicolas Maduro. And during the 12-day war, the day prior to the U.S. Striking the Iranian nuclear facility in Fordo, Trump said we're still open to negotiations. The order was already given.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to be very cautious of that, because it's interesting, right? When this, if we would have had this recording last week, it literally looked like that weekend, just a couple of days ago, would have been the strike was going to happen.
Yeah.
Like if we would have recorded this on Friday and you would have released it over the weekend, it would have been fundamentally different conversation where he gave the impression that strikes were imminent.
Well, that's why I gave the date and time earlier. I was like, this is for context. We're going to try and get this out as fast as possible. But who the hell knows what's happening 5 minutes after?
But now we're literally going to finish this, and then we're going to get reports that it started. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Classic. But and Sunday, there was kind of this change where it looks like the negotiations. We see Steve Witkoff leading it. One of the interesting aspects is that, and I think maybe this is why, is the Wall Street Journal released a really good report indicating that there is concern within the U.S. military that since Trump is going to do kind of regime change, that he just doesn't want to do a symbolic strike. He just doesn't want to do a one and done. He doesn't want to repeat, the nuclear strike 2.0.
Yeah.
Like if he's going to go, he's going to go. The concern within the Pentagon is, well, we don't have the assets in place to defend all our interests there, not only military, but even our allies. And that kind of goes to, again, the air defense specifically. So the Patriots, the THAADs, the guys I used to work for, the naval destroyers, the Aegis system as well. Because again, they know that the problem is going to be the Iranian ballistic missile force. And unlike the 12-day war, which was between Israel and Iran, Iran had a constraint because Iran has the largest ballistic missile force in the Middle East. But a lot of their ballistic missiles is what we would call short-range ballistic missiles. Less than 500 kilometers, right? Less than 700. Well, when you're talking about Israel-Iran, those don't reach Israel. It's the medium-range ballistic missiles, right? And specific systems to mention, for example, would be the Shahab-3, the Ghadr, the Khorramabad. Like these are large missiles. I read one, but for your listeners who might know, like think of like the North Korean ones from the movies that got huge and tall. Those are the medium range ballistic missiles. So the problem the Iranians had when dealing with Israel is they had to leverage, they couldn't use their short range ballistic missiles. They had to use the medium range ballistic missiles to hit Israel just because of a distance problem. Mm-hmm. In this construct, the short range ballistic missiles are phenomenal to strike U.S. interests and even our allies' interests in the Middle East, right? Like what we saw against Qatar when the Iranians bombed Ayudin Air Base, those were the short-range ballistic missiles. That is a lot easier for them to kind of make that impact. And I think the issue is on Sunday is, it looks like they're deploying more and more assets, and we're still seeing through open source, like all these military aircrafts deploying what looks like appears to be the air defense because they're very, very concerned. And the forced posture we're seeing does indicate that if Trump decides to make a strike, it looks like he's going to go for regime change. And if he goes for regime change, the risk you have is, Iran has nothing to lose.
Yeah. Kind of just hit the button, fire everything if they want.
Go crazy. Mm-hmm. Right? If you're going to do regime change, like why didn't Iran launch? They launched 12 ballistic missiles against Ayudin. And oh, by the way, they told the Americans and the Qataris beforehand, hey, we're bombing Ayudin.
Yeah.
It was a way to let them save face. Okay, you bombed Ayudin, move on. Mm-hmm. Right?
Well, even when you're talking about that, so there's the kind of the threat that's nearby. So whether they have assets in the region, Israel be kind of your medium range. But what about overseas? When we talk about like a lot of these, you see on the news, and Sarah Adams, she does like a lot on this where they're talking about sleeper cells, and there's people that are in all these different countries that kind of, when they get the go word, can wreak a lot of havoc. So, is that a big part of their strategy as well?
I would say, if you're going to analyze this, right? That would fall within the domain of the IRGC Quds Force, and we know Hezbollah would be the primary proxy network that they would leverage. It would be interesting to see, because of all the military operations that Israel has done against Hezbollah, has that had an impact on their expeditionary capabilities, right? That would be an interesting analysis. Like we know, for example, last year, the United States foiled a terrorist plot by Iran to assassinate the Israeli ambassador to Mexico.
Okay.
And they did a lot of this. Yeah, they did all this planning out of the Iranian embassy in Tehran. The Iranian embassy out of Caracas in Venezuela, right? And this was still when Maduro was president. So we do know that. We do know they have a presence in the United States. There's been Hezbollah operatives that have been here for a long time. We do know of IRGC Quds Force probably here in a long time. That's kind of one of the main concerns, that they would do terrorist attacks. And it goes back to, if you're doing regime change, that's kind of the risk. What do you have to lose?
Yeah.
That's when all bets are off. And I think that's the problem. So I would be looking at that. I wouldn't discount the loss of Maduro also probably had an impact on the Islamic Republic's ability to kind of project and kind of operate in the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, has not been eliminated, but there might have been a degradation, but to enough where these kind of capabilities and all that inside the United States are, removed completely. No, there's still a threat. Yeah.
When you talk about regime change, now I know a lot of people have really strong feelings about this, but is that ever possible? I'm just gonna go real broad. Is that even possible in the Middle East? And I'll just add a bit on there because it seems like we have some friends of the West at certain points, but even once some of those people get in, they're either it's very weak, or they might be friendly, but they still don't necessarily like agree with everything the West does. So they kind of just later on turn into something that they might not be allies at some point. Now I know there is a whole lot of back and forth of like the U.S. abandoned us or this happened. And
Yeah.
again, it's complex. It's more than just complicated. But is regime change a thing that is possible in your opinion?
I think, what's very interesting, like if you look at Venezuela, that was a leadership change, not a regime change.
Yeah.
Because who took over in Venezuela was Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president. Yeah. And then the two key figures within Venezuela who really had the power of maintaining the regime was the Minister of Defense, was Vladimir Padrino Lopez, right? He's the Minister of Defense. He kind of though goes with the wind, whichever direction blows, he just kind of follows, like whatever. Like I'm just going to do my thing, get rich. I don't give a shit. And then the bad guy, like the worst possible person imaginable, is Diosdado Cabello, right? They're both still in power. They're still both in the same positions that they were before Maduro was captured. I mean, after Maduro was captured, they just have Delcy Rodriguez, but clearly the United States is kind of managing this process. So if we look at that, then in Iran, could that be a similar situation? Because obviously, when we talk about a regime change, I think people look at 2001 Afghanistan and then 2003 Iraq. Right. Well, the thing is, we're not talking about a land invasion inside of Iran. That's not being discussed. That's not what military assets has been deployed. So we're not doing, and I think one of the lessons learned from 2003 was that the era was de-Baathification was a mistake. So obviously there's going to have to be elements within the Islamic Republic if that's the goal. How does that look? How does a transition government look? Do they just get somebody kind of within the technocratic government of Iran? Because there is a huge technocratic element within Iran that kind of move this forward. There is concerns about some of these technocratic governments because there's been a huge Islamicification targeted by the Islamic Republic against these technocrats. So it's a very convoluted, complex problem set. It would be interesting to see. Obviously, you have the Shah. He's a very polarizing figure, not only inside of Iran, obviously, but even in the exile community. But that's the problem, right? And how does that look like and who is it? And, the main impediment to all this is the IRGC in many aspects can act like a huge spoiler to this. And there's always been a concern that there might be a scenario where the IRGC launches a coup to try to take power to themselves. And I think that would be a scenario where maybe the situation was worse if that were to happen than if we just kept the supreme leader in power.
I really appreciate how you kind of frame some of this stuff and bring all that out, because I think a lot of the conversation just gets oversimplified. And I was talking about the example with Venezuela. People say, well, you just left the vice president in. Well, are we going to send Americans in and like run the country? Are we going to have this group come in? Is that group still there? Like there's just so much to it, and people don't give it its due. They don't give, that process. They don't do the analysis and go, wow, there's a lot happening here. So no, I really do appreciate the way that you kind of talk about this and how you lay it out for people to understand. Like it is really a difficult situation.
Yeah. And, it's funny, like, and I appreciate it. Thank you. I try to tell that, like, and I mean, I'll go, another example, which is what, I do, and I cover Mexican cartels. And I tell people, you think Iran is complex? You think China and Russia is complex? Join me in cartel lab. I mean, because it is like an insanely complex issue.
Yeah.
An insanely complex issue. You have scenarios and situations where you have to analyze Mexican cartels, how they operate inside of Mexico. And then you have to analyze them, how they operate outside of Mexico internationally. And then when you analyze Mexican cartels, the problem you run into is there's not a cartel.
Yeah.
They're You have the Sinaloa cartel, who's in civil war. The Gulf cartel, who has a civil war. Jalisco New Generation cartel, CDN, the Santa Rosa Luna cartel. You can go on and on and on. They operate differently in different territories. They fight each other. What's the role of the government? And within the government, is it like you have the local, state, and federal? And it's just this very complex, convoluted problem set that unfortunately I think tries to get oversimplified. And I have conversations with a lot of people, and I say, you cannot oversimplify a complex issue. Now, you can try to simplify an explanation so people can understand it, but that doesn't mean it's a solution.
The way I kind of look at it is, so Chris Dalby, I don't know if you know him. He kind of does, Chris Dalby, he does a lot of writing on LinkedIn, but he has a few books out. And when I was reading some of his books on the cartels, all it made me think about was daytime soap operas. And I might be dating myself, but I saw these as a kid and it was just funny. Like, it's all these love triangles and there's like people backstabbing each other. Now just imagine that, but with a lot of guns, a lot of firepower. And that's what the books kind of made me think of, as like just people constantly cheating on each other and doing all kinds of things, like making deals behind their backs. And, like you said, it's civil war, but within a group. Just a very violent civil war. So people just, you can give it like a simplified explanation, but even then, I think people still have to realize like there's a lot you don't know, and you also don't know what you don't know. So have some humility and just, we're all just trying to make sense of what the hell all these people in decision-making spots are doing.
I like that Donald Rumsfeld quote, the unknown unknowns and then the known unknowns, right? And it's true, right? Yeah. And I would tell people, and that's the thing, because that's, it's funny, like the Sinaloa cartel civil war literally happened because one of Los Chapitos, which are the son of the Chapo, who owned one of the factions, betrayed Miles Zambada. They turned him into the U.S., They backstabbed him and sent him over to the U.S., and that's what caused the Sinaloa cartel civil war. I think there's a lot of areas of analysis that when you try to look at it and try to pierce through, but in the end of the day, one of the things that I would tell people is inside of Mexico. Again, we're talking about Mexican cartels inside of Mexico, not internationally and how they operate outside, but mostly inside of Mexico. The irony of the situation is, you can find in ways more similarities to how these guys operate and fight. If you were to compare Mexican cartels to ISIS in Syria, than how it's being framed right now as organized crime. So when you hear the term organized crime or even cartels, you kind of think of gang violence, your Scarface, The Godfather. That's what you have in mind. That's that's what gets into your brain. It's like, that is a completely wrong way of analyzing the Mexican cartel problem set inside of Mexico. I literally wrote an article for Newsline Institute that my argument is called the militarization of drug cartels. And the problem we run into is I hear people criticize, right, the US or Mexico, and they say, the war on drugs, the war on cartels, like, this is why you can't militarize the conflict. My counter to them is, the cartels are militarizing.
Yeah.
They don't give a damn about social, and policy debates that we might have in a university drinking coffee. They don't give a rat's ass.
Even on that though, and this is something that we were kind of talking about a little before we started the recording, but I think a lot of people are really stuck in their definitions of what exactly organized crime is, what exactly terrorism is, and we're seeing a lot of blending together. So while we're all bickering amongst each other of what we want to call something or how we're going to address it or what resources to throw at it, they're making money and killing people or whatever their business is. So we're just losing. But that is one thing I did want to ask. Do you see a lot of overlap between the terrorist organizations and stuff going on in the Middle East and some of the tactics? So you've kind of mentioned that already, but how much of an overlap? Like, are these guys bringing people over? They're hanging out with each other, learning their tactics, their trade craft.
So it's interesting. Well, one of the things we do know, for example, Colombian mercenaries get heavily recruited by Mexican cartels, specifically Jalisco New Generation cartel and the United cartels, and we see a large contrast. And I don't know why, but we see a large concentration of Colombian, specifically Michoacan, which is where both cartels are at, and both of them are foreign terrorist organizations declared by the Trump administration. And a lot of these mercenaries these Colombian mercenaries actually have experience fighting in Ukraine. So they fight there, and then once their contract is up in Ukraine, they get sent over and recruited by Mexican cartels, and then they fight here. Right. And that's kind of what we see, some of the trade crafts and obviously lessons learned applied. We always knew of multiple veterans from around the world, US, probably Canadian, obviously, Guatemalans. Guatemalans are also never heavily recruited, but, they recruit from anywhere around the world to serve, for money. What I would tell, okay, so here's where they have things in common. I would say a lot of it's like the tactics and the idea of terror.
Okay.
Right. And I think the utilization of terror is a key component of Mexican cartels. It is a defining feature of Mexican cartels. It is this idea of normalizing violence in Mexican society is a defining feature and goal of how Mexican cartels operate, which again is very similar to what ISIS did in Iraq and Syria, not only for inside Iraq and Syria, but also to the international audience.
I want to just jump in real quick because I got to try and think of how to frame this. So with a lot of the terrorist organizations, I think a lot of people think of it as it's ideology, it's religion, and that's why they do things. Organized crime, I'll just use kind of the old school definition. Organized crime cartels, they are purely motivated by money. So you can't call them terrorists. But maybe we're looking at the motivation wrong. Maybe we're looking at something wrong because you're saying the defining piece is going to be the terror that they're instilling.
And it's one of the defense. So I would agree with you. Look, this is to make it as a simple an explanation as I can. What is a Mexican cartel? Think of Amazon, the corporation, Blackwater, the private military corporation, merged to one. That's what a cartel is in Mexico, right?
Okay.
And the other way to analyze them is from a drug perspective or even product, because they don't only. Side note, Jalisco New Generation cartel is huge in oil smuggling. Massive oil smugglers into the U.S. from stealing from Mexico. But how you would have to analyze from a drug perspective, how do cartels operate? The shipping container Maersk, right? The shipping company. They have products in Shanghai. They need to take it to L.A. That's their goal. They don't care what's in it. They just need to get them from point A to point B. Cartels are in the similar construct at the macro level. I need to take these drugs or these commodities or these products. For example, Michoacan, when I mentioned earlier, a lot of that is avocado and lime. They fight a lot for that. I need to get this sent to somewhere in the U.S. or somewhere in Canada. And then at that point, it's the gangs, you guys' responsibility, and that's where you have your law enforcement, right? That's why Sinaloa cartel is okay, we got to be very careful to just throw labels around of cartel members that they're operating at the macro.
If a guy has a face tattoo, oh my God, people losing their minds.
Which I talked to, it's funny, I did talk to a journalist about this. I wouldn't use tattoos per se to analyze cartels. But yes, they're profit motivated. I 100 agreed. But if that's the reason why we're going to say they're not terrorists, it's kind of insane to me. Because what cartels do is they use violence and politics to achieve an economic gain, right? They have an economic objective, so they use violence and politics to achieve it. That's what a cartel is. So the underlying feature, though, is the violence. It is an inherent component of Mexican cartels' operations. Inherent for a multitude of reasons. One, if you normalize the Mexican society of extreme levels of violence, you're not going to create the political pressure to change it.
Yeah.
Violence is never going to then be a political motivating factor inside of Mexico to change the situation on the ground, right? The irony of the situation, if anybody's seen Narcos Mexico, there's one of the scenes is where they kill the bishop and then they go after the Arellano Felix organization, the Tijuana cartel, right? Because they killed the bishop and that just caused an uproar in Mexico. How dare you do this? This is unacceptable. To the point where the Mexican government said, okay, Tijuana cartel, I got to go after you. Like, you're done, even though you guys pay us. But I look at the political pressure. The fact of the matter is, because it's been so put as part of Mexican society and culture, and it's not even just the narco corridos, the narco culture. No, that's a separate conversation. This is just the violence. Because it's so normal, it breeds this sense of impunity. Because now, we all do this, by the way. If I were to see a dismembered body in the streets of Chihuahua, my immediate thought process is, he was a cartel member. He had it coming. No due process. None whatsoever.
Yeah.
Normalize it.
It makes me think of domestic abuse. Like, they might call at the beginning, but if nothing happens, police keep showing up, and then it's like the fifth and sixth time, and the person, the offender just keeps getting released or doesn't get charged because there's nothing to charge with at the time. Eventually, they just stop calling. It becomes normalized. So,
and then I think that's where from this terrorism perspective, it's like we are fundamentally ignoring the violence that is grotesque. And I've seen my fair share of ISIS videos. I was deployed to Jordan during the counter-ISIS campaign in 2015-16. I saw ISIS execution videos. I'm telling you right now, the worst execution videos I have ever seen in my life are Mexican cartel ones. Hands down. And again, the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, for example, last year did 2 car bombings in Guanajuato. Right? I mean, at some point, because when you label the foreign terrorist organization that the Trump administration does it, the thing is people think organized crimes. Guys, this isn't Ottawa.
Yeah.
Gang violence in Ottawa. That's not what's the problem inside of Mexico. Does that happen? Absolutely. But is that really the problem? My argument would be if that's what we have to deal with, even though it's still the most violent cities in the world, that would be a success in many aspects. It's this militarization. It goes back to that conversation of the terror as a key component, and cartels have made the conscious decision to militarize themselves. And so, unfortunately, it's this cycle of violence that in many times gets instigated and propagated by Mexican cartels because they want that as a defining feature of Mexican society.
Interesting. Fascinating stuff, man. You know what? We're just coming up to the end of the time. I could talk to you for hours. This stuff is great. Just to get it out there and really provide the education. And again, going back to just how people think about some of these problems, like we really need to just take a step back, have some of that humility and go, okay, what are we dealing with? Like, nobody's the source of all the answers. So where can we find them and reach out to those people that are really in the know? So just at the end of the time here, can you just tell us some of the projects or anything that you got going on that you'd like to put a plug in for?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity again. Thank you so much. This was a phenomenal conversation, a lot broader. I know we kind of started out Iran and then really broadened it a lot, and I love it. And I think it's interesting. It wasn't a geopolitical per se conversation. I think it was more trying to analyze how do we analyze information and try to get there from an intelligence perspective, which hopefully is very good and useful for your listeners. So again, my company Artorias, we have an app called SitRep, subscription-based, $10 a month. You get news around the world. Canada has its own feed, the US, Botswana, anywhere around the world. All AI-driven analysis and collection and dissemination of the information. And then obviously myself, All Source News. I just recently created my Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, where I try to do video content outside of just Twitter, where I push information. And that's you can find me there. Again, I would love to have this conversation again. This was phenomenal, great. So thank you so much for happening, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Awesome. Hang on the line for 2 seconds. I'll say bye offline. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there, so pass it along. Thanks again.